And there's lots of examples that we see it all the time, actually, where an employee takes an email the wrong way. They take it as a attack on them, or they take it as a demand. They've got to do this, and then when the two parties meet and discuss it, it's actually fine.
Yeah.
They actually were both on the same page in the first place. So, it's really hard to get, and we actually see clients use things like emojis all the time as a way to, you can actually add some emotion or some subtlety to an email, perhaps. I mean, it's never going to replace in-person conversations, but you've got to be really conscious.
Hello and welcome to another edition of Better Business, Better Life. Today I'm joined by Laurence McLean, who is the Associate Director of Operations of Employsure here in New Zealand. And of course, Employsure is actually an Australian and New Zealand company. Is that right?
That's right. That's correct.
Welcome to the studio. Lovely to have you.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
Yeah. So I'm very much looking forward to talking to you because we talk about EOS as people being like the life force of the business. People can make or break a business. And obviously your specialty is around ensuring that both the employer and the employee are on the same page and working together. So looking forward to hearing about that. But first of all, let me just hear a little bit about your background. So how did you come to be at Employsure? What's your background, Laurence? What do you do?
Great. Thanks, Debra. It's great to be here. Look, I really come from a legal and business background. I've worked in a couple of different organisations. When I first started actually outside of university, I worked at Community Law Waikato, and we really worked with employees with difficult situations that they were in. So looking at the employee side of the equation.
Yep.
For the last 6 years or so, I've been working at Employsure New Zealand, looking at the employer side of the equation. So I've kind of seen both sides of the equation. I've seen the difficulties that can arise from an employee point of view, from an employer point of view, and also what works well, perhaps what doesn't work well, and the sorts of, I think, situations, the sorts of processes, the sorts of opportunities and ideas that both sides of that equation can use to have a really, really successful employment relationship. And I'm sure as you and your listeners will know that a successful employment relationship always leads to a better business.
Yes, absolutely. I completely agree. So I think that sometimes, though, people get a little bit nervous because, EOS is actually an American operating system. Yeah. And so, when we, first get sort of trained in EOS and they talk about people, they kind of go, if somebody's not the right person, you need to get rid of them. Yeah. It's not quite as simple as that over here. We have slightly different laws for good reason. Yeah. So people get nervous when they know that they have to actually deal with people issues, but they shouldn't be nervous, should they?
No, that's right. I mean, if you start with really strong fundamentals, you maintain that through the entire employment relationship, you can 9 times out of 10 have a really successful employment relationship. And as you spoke about, it's not quite the same as the fire at will system in America. We do have more obligations here. And in fact, New Zealand does have a fairly complex and sometimes grey employment space. But, having really strong processes, having that support, planning for those sorts of situations that you might come across can make your life a whole lot easier, both as a business owner and as a member working within a business as well. So, if you come with that sort of approach, you come with that sort of planned approach, then it's all surmountable.
Fair enough. And so, in some of the businesses that are growing very, very fast, things change quite rapidly. Yeah. How do you kind of make sure that you are keeping people up to date with what is going on? And I suppose this is a question I've actually got in my mind. Yeah. We have job descriptions in the beginning, and job descriptions when you first start, they might change over time. That's so right. How do you make sure that you keep on top of that as the business changes, as the needs change?
Yeah, look, I think there's a couple of tips you can kind of take away there that can really help with that. I think number one is communication. Yep. I think communication can overcome a lot of issues. And as you said, businesses grow, businesses change. All sorts of things can change an employment relationship, and in fact, it often does. Yep. That's kind of what often engages an employee to stay, is the fact that there's new challenges, new opportunities. But if you communicate through that, if you keep your employees in the loop in terms of that communication cycle, if you make sure that they're coming along with you on that journey as a business owner, as in terms of growing your business, they'll often be on board. They'll often work with you to help your business be more successful. Yep. They'll often be more tolerant if perhaps things don't go exactly the way you expect, and things really ever do go exactly the way that you expect. So I think having that really strong communication, having that joint, that joint vision, that kind of joint enterprise in terms of the business can really help to make sure that as the business grows, as things change, the employees on board and they're meeting you. When you're making those changes, when you want to, expand your business, if you want to try out new areas, you want to do whatever it is, the employees are there along with you.
It's not coming as a complete shock to them, is what you're saying.
Exactly. And I think, New Zealand has a very laid back kind of culture, and we often run into a lot of employers who have taken that sort of laid back approach with their employees, and that often works really well for perhaps the first couple of years, and then things change, or economy may change, and the business may become tighter, the margins may become tighter, and there's often motivates a need for change within the business, and the employee that's been used to this, kind of more laissez-faire approach, or things working a certain way. The business owner may have been thinking about these challenges that they've been facing for perhaps the last 6, 12, 9 months, whatever it may be. And then they go to roll it out with their employee, and they get big pushback from their employee because it is coming as a shock to them, as you said. So I think it's sometimes not a very Kiwi thing to do, is to be communicative and to have that really kind of
open,
frank relationship. Exactly. But it is, I think, what's really needed, particularly if you're a growing business, if you're a changing business. Yeah.
Part of the EOS model actually kind of advocates for, first of all, weekly meetings at all levels. So everybody's always across the board, and cascading messages, they go up and down so people know what is happening at the senior leadership team level. And then having a sort of a joint, we call it the state of the company update at least once a quarter, which is like telling people, this is where we were headed. This is what we've managed to achieve. This is what hasn't worked. This is what has worked. And here's the next quarter, and sharing that journey so that nothing comes as a surprise.
This is right, and that's both beneficial from just from an engagement point of view with your employees, keeping them engaged and on board, but also from a legal point of view. You actually have a legal obligation as an employer to be open and communicative with your employees. So you should be not, obviously you don't have to communicate everything, and
sometimes it's best not to.
Exactly. And, obviously some elements remain confidential, but as much as is possible, you have an obligation, I think, legally and perhaps also morally, to communicate with your employees and keep them up to date with what's happening.
Yeah. And I think I see it a lot when businesses grow quite quickly. So you think if in the beginning, when it's a small business, you might have 5, 6, 7, let's say 10 people. And it's really easy to keep those communication lines open because it's a small team. You can meet on a regular basis. You're catching up with each other. And then it grows from 10 to 20 to 100 people. And all of a sudden those, that communication's a lot tougher, right? Because you just can't have an all staff meeting every week and have a chat about what's going on.
That's right.
Yeah. So what do you kind of recommend in terms of keeping a bigger team engaged?
I think that's really where policies, processes, documentation can be a really helpful tool. As you spoke about, when you're a smaller business, you can often do a lot of that verbally, perhaps just over email or kind of more informal methods. The bigger you grow, if you want to maintain that very consistent culture across all elements, all levels of your business, you really need to document, you really need to have process guides for everything that you're doing, not just for the employees, but also if you've got middle managers or managers in between, you've often got a business owner that has a really clear vision of what they want. They're really passionate about what they're doing. You might also have employees like that, but things get lost in translation. And so having really clear procedures for employees, but also for managers, guides in terms of the way they should be dealing with employees, or the ability for employees to potentially skip their manager and go to the owner or to a higher level manager. That's what really allows you to keep that same sort of success, that same sort of cohesion or consistency, even as you grow and you start to add more and more levels or layers to your business.
We have a thing called also like a quarterly conversation, which is a more informal discussion as well, which I highly. So you've got the formal side that you want to do, but there's also an opportunity for these people to actually feedback on what's working, what's not working for them, and how they're going in their role, how they're going against the values. Having those conversations, but even though they're informal, they're still regular. So they are booked into the calendars. People know that they're coming, and then they feel like they've got a chance to actually have some input.
That's right. And the more you communicate, as you spoke about earlier, the more you communicate with your employees, the more that they feel part of it, the more they're going to play their part in terms of having the business succeed.
And especially the business changes, like I said, because let's face it, sometimes we can't help it. The last 3 years have been a great example of things that are completely beyond our control and can actually affect the business. Okay. One of the things that we find as the business grows, and you move away from being a smaller business to a slightly larger business, is you've got all these additional kind of layers, if you like, and different levels of people. And then there'll be a time when maybe somebody who fitted in the beginning of the business maybe doesn't work so much in where the business is headed because the roles have changed. So it's not about the person. They might still share the company values, but they're, they might not fit into the role that is evolving. we have a thing called an accountability chart, which is where we actually go through and we go, right, what are the functions that we need and what do these roles look like? And then we actually have a thing called GWC. We kind of go, does this person actually really get it? Do they want it? Do they have capacity to do it? Which is a little bit of the, do they get it in terms of what the role is about? Do they want it, as in genuinely want it? Do they have the capacity to do it? What happens if you see a gap there? What happens if the role is evolving and maybe the person isn't evolving with the role? How would you handle that?
Look, it kind of depends where that problem kind of arises in terms of the life cycle as to what approach you would take. But as with all issues, the earlier you kind of catch it, the earlier you deal with it, the easier it is to fix. So, as you see the role changing or, perhaps your values change and that can happen all the time, just making sure that you're not to keep on the same beat all the time, but communicating with your employees.
I think it's absolutely key.
And making sure that they understand that there's a change. You update, if you've got perhaps a performance appraisal document and it has your old values or your old duties or your old vision, making sure that's updated regularly and that you're assessing your employees against that, the most up-to-date, the most current version of what you're looking for. You're using that with your employees, because not only does that mean that what their capacity is or what they want to do that is, but they also know what's expected from them. One of the biggest issues we often find with employees who are perhaps seen as lower performers by their managers or by their employers is that those employees don't actually understand what it is they should be doing or what sort of goal they're heading towards.
So they haven't got those measurables in place.
Exactly.
I always sort of joke because it's like it's boundaries. We actually, as humans, we quite like boundaries. We like to know what we can do, what we can't do. And we also like to know what we're aiming for as well, because sometimes without those measurables, you feel like you don't have anything. And then, of course, if you start to pick somebody up on performance and kind of go, well, you're not performing.
That's right.
Well, based on what?
Yes, and that's exactly right. And as I say, the biggest gap is often for poor performers is just not understanding and perhaps the manager or the owner having objectives or expectations that employee had no idea about. And then often that's going to create a real big tension or a real big gap between the two parties.
And it just comes back to communication again, right? It's miscommunication. So it's like if you're not being really clear and sharing that clarity all the time, then there's room for error.
Oh, absolutely. And I think, again, 9 times out of 10, communication can fix most problems. You'll get the odd one that perhaps you can be a really clear communicator and there's still issues, but for the most part, we are all human beings, and I think one of the difficulties of running a business is you're dealing with humans every day. And I think people just want to know what's happening. They want to know where they're going. They want to know how they're working with their colleagues to get there.
Yeah, absolutely. We use a thing called a people analyzer, and I didn't get to share this with you outside, but it's basically we put the core values across the top, and then we use it to actually analyze how the person is going with those core values. And we have a really, really simple methodology. So if you are 90% of the time you are exhibiting the core value, you get a tick. If you're kind of flip-flopping, you get a plus minus. If you're really not exhibiting that core value, you get a minus. And I always sort of think the plus minus is where there is room for improvement for you as a leader as well, right? Understanding what's really causing that. Because if somebody's flip-flopping, it doesn't mean that they don't share that core value. It just means something is probably going on for them.
Yeah, and really inconsistent performance is a really clear earlier warning sign that perhaps performance is dropping or there may be major issues later on. As I said earlier, if you can nip that in the bud really, really quickly or early, the employee will be happier and you'll probably be happy as a business owner because your employee is doing what you want them to do and they're going towards that vision. So, that sort of flip-flopping that sometimes they're good, sometimes perhaps not so good. Those are really the times you want to step in and intervene. And
they're red flags, aren't they? I mean, it's a red flag that there's something going on that you need to look at as a leader, as a manager, and see what's really going on.
That's right. And again, Kiwi culture, I think people tend to not really deal with issues until it's a really big issue.
Yes.
And that's a really hard thing to do. And we'd often help employers in very difficult situations. And it's tough. And it's really emotionally draining on those employees. It's financially draining on their business. Those ones that can give us a call early or look to nip it in the bud early, those are the ones where we can overcome those fairly easily and have that really continued success or keep growing.
And we are all humans, right? Which means we do stuff up. With all the best intentions in the world, there are times when we make a mistake.
That's right.
Even as leaders and managers, right? And sometimes that can blow out of proportion. I've seen it happen where actually a tiny little thing that was just a mistake has blown into this massive big issue. What do you do in that situation?
Look, we do see that a lot, I have to say. We have a lot of our clients that call into Employersure, and what looks to us as a relatively minor issue is actually a really big issue for our clients. And when we kind of dig in and we speak to our clients about, well, what's really driving this anxiety or this worry with this issue, and what we often see under the surface is that there's actually a whole lot of other issues that have kind of been bubbling away under the surface that haven't been dealt with, and you get the one issue that kind of breaks the straw that breaks the camel's back, essentially. So, if you have, again, not repeating the same thing as before, but if you have a minor issue, deal with it early. Don't kind of put it to the side, brush it into the carpet. Oh, look, it's just one time. I hope it goes away, because you do that 3 or 4 times and suddenly you've got a big problem. And that's the clients who we see really struggle, the ones that are more proactive about dealing with it. And you can do it in a really informal, quick way. You just pull the person aside, have a really informal chat to them. Hey, look, I saw you did this. Here's a tip about how you can avoid that in the future, or here's how I can help you stop yourself getting into a situation in the future. And I think employees really appreciate that sort of regular feedback and formal feedback. I think when you make it a really formal process, or it's a bigger issue and you're dealing with it, that's where you start to get some pushback from the employee. So
because they feel a bit persecuted.
That's right, or they feel like that's happened a couple of times before and it wasn't an issue then.
Anything.
So why is it an issue now? So dealing with it in an informal way, making sure you're being upfront about it. You've got to be, you've got to front foot some of these issues. If you do that, then it avoids them bubbling into bigger issues or building into issues that perhaps become outside of your control.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's why we kind of advocate for weekly meetings and actually having those weekly conversations. And also, I think you made a really good point. Like, don't have that critique in front of all of their peers either. It's like, pull them aside, have that conversation about what's going on rather than putting them on the spot in front of everybody else.
That's right.
But it needs to be dealt with as soon as it happens, as opposed to letting it, because I think the thing about boundaries is boundaries are set because they are consistent and they're repeated over and over again. And if you allow a certain behavior to happen and it happens, once or twice without being picked up, then you're basically moving that boundary and going, this is acceptable.
Exactly. And I think when employees feel like they're being treated unfairly, and that's a great example of when they often do feel like they're being treated unfairly, that's where you really start to get that tension. That's where you get the breakdown of that relationship. Employees that know where the boundaries are, where the walls are, where they can step, where they can't step, although that may seem like it's a bit more controlling, it's actually helpful for them, and employees often appreciate that a lot more than they do more vague, ambiguous kind of instructions or expectations.
If you do sort of feel that maybe the relationship isn't working as well as it can, I know you're a lawyer, so I'm asking more from it. Is it okay to have an informal conversation, or are you better to follow a performance management procedure? I'm just wondering, where's the starting point for when you're feeling unhappy? Where is the starting point?
I would say the starting point is always an informal conversation. I mean, you can jump straight to formal if you want to, but that is a more contentious process, and it often comes with a bit more push and shove, so to speak. So if you start with that informal conversation, perhaps the employee may really be really responsive to that. They may make the change and done, perfect.
Lovely.
And it doesn't eliminate your ability to have a more formal process after that. So we always advocate for an escalation of steps. So you start with that really informal process, maybe a quick chat, pull them aside, maybe in their one-to-one. If that doesn't work, then perhaps you put in an email, you put it in writing. You can perhaps reiterate it in a letter or in an update to the job description. If that's still not working, you've had those sorts of conversations and the employee is still below expectations or still causing major issues within the organization, then you've got that formal ability. You've got the ability to go formal and have a really formal process, and make really clear what your expectations are. And if they're still not being met, to look at more formal disciplinary outcomes.
And I think it comes down to, I mean, I've seen with a lot of businesses that I work with is that we always say that every single person should have at least one measurable. That's their boundary, right? This is what we expect from these are the outcomes we expect. That's measured on a regular basis, and therefore you can have those conversations when it's not being met. If you haven't got those measures in place, it makes those conversations more difficult, doesn't it?
It does. It makes it more difficult in terms of trying to communicate to your employee what they expect. It makes it more difficult in terms of showing them where perhaps they have fallen short. It can be really hard if you don't have something to measure against to actually get the employee to even accept that they have fallen short of your expectations.
And it can become personal, I think. It feels more personal because we're not talking about facts and figures, but we're talking about, well, I don't believe that you've performed well.
That's right. Oh, no, you're spot on, absolutely. And those are the sorts of relationships that we often see that the biggest issues in is where either the employer or the employee feel there's a personal aspect to it. So really making it as impersonal as you possibly can, making it objective as you possibly can, not only helps you in terms of processes and speed of resolving that, but it also leaves more options open for you from a legal point of view as well. So it's kind of got that dual benefit.
So that when it comes down to the role and what's expected in your role delivery, that becomes quite easy. When it comes down to a values kind of fit, so sometimes, this is just from my personal experience. You can interview people and they can come across wonderfully. You can do a reference check, and they're absolutely, they get they're never going to give you a reference. It's not a great reference. Like, let's be realistic about it. And so you employ the person, and they actually come onto the job, and then suddenly you realise that there actually is a bit of a values mismatch. Obviously, the best thing to do is to make sure that you do as much possible up front to make sure that they do fit with the values.
That's right.
But what happens if they just don't quite fit in? What are the options there?
Values can be an element of performance. So Employsure is actually a values-driven organisation, and in our regular performance reviews, we have a values section where we score people against our various values that we have. So there's a kind of more formal objective aspect in terms of the
data,
KPIs,
the measurables,
and there's also a section on values. So treat a value like any other performance metric. How are they performing against that value? And again, if you see a long-standing issue with an employee being inconsistent with your values as an organisation, or perhaps not living up to your values, you can treat that as the same as any other sort of performance
metric.
issue. As if it was late, it can be the same as if perhaps they're not living up to that client is king or customer comes first sort of value as well.
Sure. And I think, but it's important that you actually give specific examples, isn't it? There's no point in just saying, hey,
That's
look,
right.
I gave you a minus. Laurence, I think you're a minus when it comes to being humbly confident. You kind of go, well, what, you've got to give some reference points to go, this is the behavior I've observed, or this is what I saw you do, and give them some actual, I always say like 3 reference points is quite nice.
That's right. There's kind of 2 elements to every performance sort of process. One element is that kind of guide to what the employee should be doing, or as you say, examples of what living up to these values can mean. And then the other document is how they measure against those values. And those 2 documents in combination can really make sure that you're on the right track and you're keeping your employees on track in terms of their performance.
So we call it the core value speech, and the core value speech is about, you go through the values. So what it means around here, what it means, what we do, what we don't do. And again, it's about boundaries. If you don't clearly articulate that from the beginning, it's really hard for somebody to understand what there is expected of them.
And not only that, but it also, if you have a couple of employees that perhaps aren't living up to those values, when you have a new employee that comes in, they're going to copy that behavior. If you've got a whole lot of employees that are living up to those values and are really values driven and everyone's in line and pointing in the same direction, when a new employee comes in, they're going to fall in line with everybody else. If you have a couple of people that are falling short or have values issues, that can spread very, very quickly amongst an organisation.
I call it the rotten apple effect.
Yes, exactly. So it's not just about dealing with that employee. It's not just the benefit of being able to resolve it more easily if you address it quickly. It also has the benefit of flowing through to other employees as well.
Sure. Okay. So I didn't realise that it really is the same as any other performance metrics. As long as you've been really clear and upfront that this is what we expect of you, then you are absolutely able to hold them just as accountable as to whether or not they're achieving their KPIs. That we call it measurables, but the things that we're expecting of them in the role. Yeah,
absolutely. The employment law in New Zealand, although it can be tough and it's got a lot of kind of trapdoors you can fall into, it's not necessarily prescriptive in terms of the way you have to run your business. You can run your business in whatever way you like, so long as you're being open and communicative with your employees, so long as you're doing it in a way that allows your employees to succeed, and that if there are issues, that they be dealt with in a fair way. It doesn't go beyond that in terms of how you need to do it. What your values are, or what your performance metrics are, or how you address those sorts of performance issues. It's up to you as a business owner, as an organisation, to decide how you want to do that. So long as you're being open and communicative and clear and constructive with your employees.
And as you said, that they're having the boundaries, knowing what they can and they can't do. There's no confusion. It all comes down to communication, doesn't it?
It does. Absolutely.
and that's not sort of unrealistic. It's a relationship, right? And every single relationship is based on communication.
And often when I'm speaking to clients or I'm training new advisors that come into our team, I talk about as if it was one of your personal relationships. It's the same thing. And they can go really well for a long period of time, and then suddenly it doesn't work anymore. And maybe it's not quite as easy to break up an employment relationship as it is a personal relationship, but the same sorts of approaches apply. And if you're communicative in your personal relationships, you're going to be successful, and the same applies in your employment relationships as well.
I think it's really important too. Sometimes we kind of feel really worried, particularly if you've had somebody in your business for a long time, and it's no longer working, which can happen in any relationship. As you said, it can happen in your personal relationships, happen in business relationships. I think people are kind of they're nervous about sort of dealing with that because the person has been around for a long time. We don't want to upset them. But the chances are, if you're unhappy as an employer, they're probably unhappy as an employee too. And in some respects, it's kinder to have those conversations and to have those discussions and understand if there really is a fit anymore. Because if there isn't, and they do have to go somewhere else, they're probably going to find somewhere where they're happier too.
Yeah, exactly. And often when I'm dealing with employees or employees are in difficult situations, and there's a really contentious point in terms of what we're discussing, a certain issue. And what I often say is that it can actually be better for both parties for the relationship to be over, or for, if you're not happy in your work, your employer is never going to be happy either. And as an employer, if you're not happy, your employees aren't going to be happy. So you need to have both parties playing their part. If one party isn't playing their part, no matter how good the other one is, it's probably never going to work, to be honest. And look, it's a fact of life that not everybody is right for a certain role, and certain people thrive in situations, and the same people can really struggle in that same situation. So it's not a bad thing necessarily if a relationship doesn't work out. What can be really difficult is if you try to force that to work, or you try to jam a square peg into a round hole, essentially. So sometimes I think both employees and employers need to say, look, perhaps it's time to move on, or perhaps it's time to make a fundamental change in the way that we do things, because what we're doing now isn't really working.
And I think going back to our sort of GWC, that's the W is the want, right? And I think that even if you get your role and you're capable of doing it, if you don't really want to do it, it's actually bad for both parties, because you're into a situation where you're not enjoying going to work, and you're not going to bring the best to the best value to the business either.
That's right. And what was it last year? I think there was a lot of talk about quiet quitting, and that's a really great example of that. Is you may be a really capable person, but if you're not motivated to do it, you're not going to do great work. And then you're actually going to become even more unhappy as an employee, because your employer is going to start coming down on you. So
it creates a constant cycle, right?
Exactly. And then you're going to be even more unhappy, and then it goes back and forth forever. So, if you don't want to be somewhere, don't be there, is kind of the sort of advice that I would give to employees particularly. But also from an employer's point of view, they may think an employee doesn't want to be there. Perhaps they do, perhaps they don't. But what you really want to explore is opportunities before you get to that point to try to have a really constructive relationship, to maintain that relationship. If you've done all of that and it still isn't working, then perhaps time to move on. But before you get there, you've got to put a bit of effort in, basically.
And as I said, when we do the whole people analyzer thing, I think that whole plus or minus it's just an opportunity to sort of say, what can I be doing better? Because we as leaders have a responsibility to get the best out of our people. And so if somebody is underperforming or isn't, we're having some challenges with, you've got to actually first of all find out what's really going on for them what can we do to support them. Because it could I've heard horrible examples of people when they actually get asked, what's really going on for you? And they tell you something horrific that's happening at home, and you cannot separate. I know it sounds really lovely. There's personal life, there's professional life. There's not. There's a human life. It's one life. So, what is going on at home will affect you in your work environment. And I think as an employee, it's not our role to solve that, but it's to be, supportive of that and seeing what can be done or what can't be done.
That's right. And the Employment Relations Act, the main piece of legislation in New Zealand that governs employment relationships, is actually written in such a way that it places obligations on employers. It gives rights to employees. It's built on a philosophy that there's a power imbalance in an employment relationship. So by being constructed in that way, it often places the onus on the employer to have a go at fixing that issue. And again, the employers that we see, our clients that we see that are really successful, are the ones that are proactive. And the ones that we see often get into hot water are the ones that are a bit more passive, and they let issues kind of wash over them until it becomes unbearable. If you're proactive about it, if you're going to an employee that you see that is perhaps not performing as you expected, or there's a value disalignment, you go to that employee, and sometimes you've got to pull it out of them. They're not always going to be really forthcoming in terms of the issues that they have, be it at work or be it in their personal life. Sometimes you do have to pull it out of them, but when you do, you can often see, it often becomes very clear I've got this really great solution I can roll out.
Yep.
And you do that, and suddenly it's back to a really productive employment relationship. So you have to be proactive as an employer. You have to address those issues head on. You have to want to resolve them. You can't just sit back and hope that an issue is going to resolve itself, because chances are it probably won't.
Yeah, fair enough. Okay, so the really key things are communication.
That's
Really,
right, absolutely.
And having sometimes the difficult conversations, but with an open view to what might come out of it.
That's right.
Yeah. So dealing with the issues, bringing them to the forefront, I suppose not letting it fester. Is that the right word? Because a small issue can suddenly be blown completely out of proportion.
Yeah.
Communication is an interesting one. There is a propensity, I would say, in New Zealand to be a little bit passive aggressive in terms of communication, which means that email is kind of one of the most favoured tools because, I can just write it. And I've caught myself doing it at times. You kind of start typing out an email and realise even in the way that you're bashing the keys probably means you're not in the right state to be writing an email. So you have to catch yourself on that. But email is wonderful for recording, absolute events, and clarifying things, but it's not the best place to start, is it?
No, absolutely not. And as you say, email can be really clear in terms of a very black and white approach, but you often lose the implication, or you lose the subtlety of the message you're trying to give to an employee or to anyone really. So what we always recommend is you have an in-person meeting, you discuss it with your employee. You can't have it in person, even over the phone, or even by Zoom or Teams. That's better than just by email. And then you follow it up with an email after that. And the email can be a good record of what was discussed.
This is a confirmation of what was discussed as opposed to, or some clarification around some points, but not
the employer a chance to come back and say, oh no, that isn't that's not what I took away from it, or perhaps I've got a different expectation. It allows you to kind of pull out those issues, but you're never really going to be able to get across, particularly, for example, a values-driven message you want to give. It's really hard to deliver values over email. So it's having the opportunity to have that in-person conversation, to be able to deliver it with, business owners are really passionate about what they do. They're not in business, often for the money. They're in it because they're passionate. And that passion comes across in person. It often doesn't come across in email.
I think I'm half German, and so I'm actually quite blunt, and I often catch myself writing emails, and I haven't even done the niceties like, hi, how are you, or any of that stuff. And so you got to be very, and I don't ever intend for it to be blunt. I don't intend for it to be, to the point. It's just the way that I compose emails. And often that can be taken the wrong way because they don't see. So I've even added a photo to the bottom of my emails just to remind people that actually they're dealing with a human. Because, when we send off the emails, it's like the keyboard warriors, right? You've still got another person, another human at the other end who's receiving that, and you've got to be careful about how they actually receive that.
And there's lots of examples that we see it all the time actually, where an employee takes an email the wrong way. They take it as a attack on them, or they take it as a demand. They've got to do this, and then when the two parties meet and discuss it, it's actually fine. They actually were both on the same page in the first place. So, it's really hard to get, and we actually see clients use things like emojis all the time as a way to, you can actually add some emotion or some subtlety to an email, perhaps. I mean, it's never going to replace in-person conversations, but you've got to be really conscious of that.
That's interesting, isn't it? Because, I think that particularly some of the older people would kind of go, emojis are unprofessional. You can't use emojis. I actually use them all the time, even though I'm old. And I do think it's just a little bit of that sort of, trying to soften down something that I know might come across as a little bit sort of less, a little bit more blunt than most people would say it, and it's not meant that way. So I use the smiley face, or I use the I actually quite like the champagne cheers one quite a lot. Okay, so it's not unprofessional to use emojis in your emails.
I mean, look, for some businesses, they'll probably say, "What is?"
If you've got banks renting out to a customer, for example, that's a little bit different. Sure.
I think if you can't, perhaps you can't have that conversation in person, or you are trying to deliver what could come across as a harsh message, sometimes using those extra tools that you have can help to get across, as I say, that more unspoken element of it, the human element of it. Absolutely.
Okay. Working from home has become sort of this whole hybrid working model. It's kind of interesting because we had to change our business model quite significantly just because we couldn't get together in person with leadership teams. So we got into doing online, and it works. I would still pick face-to-face over it any day. But you can do it. But more and more people, and personally, when I advertise for a job, I actually said it's in person, not negotiable. That's the way I want to work. And as the employer, I'm allowed to choose the way that I want to work, right? But if people who do choose to go in the hybrid model or the work from home model, it changes the dynamics of the teams, doesn't it?
It absolutely does. And I think raised a really good point there, is that you've got to be clear from day one about what your expectation is. If you're going to have a hybrid model, are you going to agree on which days they're going to be in the office and which days they're going to be home? Or are you going to let the employee choose those? And if you let the employee choose those, it can be really hard later on to actually reverse it or say, actually, I want you to come in today, particularly because I've got a big client coming in or whatever it may be. So it's having those really clear expectation set from day one. Is it a fully from office role? Is it a fully from home role? Is it a hybrid role? If it's hybrid,
how does that work?
Basis? And then having policies and documents that support that you've got the employee's signature on, that you can use if there is a dispute or if there's a misunderstanding later on, because sometimes expectations will be very clear at the start with an employee. 6 months, 12 months go on, and suddenly you start to drift apart in terms of what each party expects. And if you can come back to a founding document that sets out what the expectations were from day one, you can keep that same sort of consistent approach the whole way through. So I think working from home it can be a really difficult situation, particularly the market is the way at the moment. It's a very employee-driven market. Employers are often having to give extra benefits to employees to attract the right staff that you want. Work from home is one example that employers are still using to attract staff. But if you're going to offer that to your employees, you've got to ask yourself, are you comfortable for that to be in place for the entirety of the employment relationship? Because
that's what you agreed to in the beginning.
That's
right. You can't change. Well, you can change the rules midway through, but you have to do it with agreement with other people. You can't just go and unanimously change it.
You can do it unilaterally.
That's what I was looking for.
But with a really, it's quite an in-depth process. You've got to go through a full consultation process with the employees. You might have to make the role redundant if they don't agree. And then potentially redeploy them into a new role that has different kind of conditions or models of working. That can be a really, not just a really complex and resource intensive process, but also a potentially legally risky process to take as well. And often changes like that are done because the company is in a difficult circumstance. The last thing you want to do is add more risk by having to change terms that employees are really attached to. So you absolutely have to think about the entirety of the relationship when you start, and not kind of think short term and say, "Hey, well, this works really well for now."
We need to employ some people right now, so we should offer work from home. Be prepared to stick with that decision.
Is it going to work for you in another year or 2 years or 5 years or 10 years?
That's right. Exactly. Okay. And so, I know I'm quite strong in my views. I do like working in an office. I like having people in the office with me. Is it okay for employers still to say this is a full-time role in the office?
Absolutely. Employers, as you said, have the right to decide the way they want their business to be run, the way they want their employees to work. And if an employee doesn't like that, they won't take the job. And actually, if you try to compromise on your values or compromise on your vision too much just to get an employee in, you're often setting yourself up for failure
in the future.
On, because that's going to come to a head. That issue's going to explode out into a big mess, basically. So I think getting the right people on from the start, being very clear about what you want, how you want your business to be run, what sort of employee is going to work really well in your organization, can make for a much more fruitful relationship later on, even if perhaps it takes you a little bit longer to find the right person at the start.
Sure. Now, you talked about, obviously, as an employer, we can't change those rules given that we employ them on that basis. What happens when the employee wants to change the way that things happen? Because I have seen this happen quite a lot, where, let's just say you have been, I'll give a fictional example, but you've been employed we're working in the office 5 days a week, and then all of a sudden the employee sort of says, well, I would like to work from home for 2 days a week. How do you deal with that as an employer?
Well, employers have the right to ask for that. They have the right to submit flexible working requests through the Employment Relations Act. It sets out a process for the way that employees can do that. And employers have an obligation both under that section in terms of flexible working, but also under their general obligation of good faith to be open and communicative to consider that, but not necessarily to agree to that. So as an employer, what you should do is make sure you've received that. Make sure you've got a process where employees can make those applications. When you receive one, you consider it. You look at it from the employee's point of view. You discuss it with the employee, perhaps hear if they've got more elements to add to it in person. And you consider it, with an open mind. But you don't necessarily have to agree to it. So long as you've gone through that process, so long as you've considered it, you've given it genuine thought, genuine consideration. If you decide it's not right for your business, that's fine. You're entitled to do that as an employer, but you've got to go through that process to consider it in the first place. You can't just say no. Or I'm not taking any applications to work from home, or I'm not taking any applications to change hours.
Right.
You've got to at least
be
allow
open
them to apply.
it.
Don't have to agree. And in fact, the Act says that an employee can't challenge a decline of a flexible working request, but they can challenge when an employer hasn't considered it.
Right. Yep.
So the Act literally says you have to consider it,
yep.
but you don't have to agree to it.
Okay, fair enough. And I suppose it's also, I mean, if the employee is a good employee, you might want to look at some other way of making it work. And so it is a negotiation process. Yeah. So we discuss all the possible options. We can look at what the actual resolution is. Yep.
And you might have a certain limit that you'll be willing to accept, and the employee might want to go beyond that, and you can negotiate about where you draw that line. I would say the only other element you've got to be aware of, though, particularly if you're giving extra benefits to good employees, is that you also have an obligation to treat all your employees fairly. And not necessarily, I mean, you can treat employees in disparate ways, so long as there is a strong justification in doing that. So, perhaps you do give employees an extra bonus or a commission or extra rights or benefits. That's fine to do, so long as you have a trail where you can show these are the performance metrics I'm basing it on. And if a lower performing employee that asked for that same benefit and got declined for it, so long as you can show, hey, look, your performance wasn't as high as this other employee that is getting this benefit. So if you've got the paperwork, you've got the processes, you've got the objective kind of model to show that, you'll be in a good position. If you don't, you could potentially get, a disparity of treatment claim from employees. That's a discrete claim that an employee can raise.
Right. Interesting. So, I mean, I think in general, what I'm taking from this is that the law here says that, we have to act with, what's the right word? Sort of openness, and we'll be willing to have the conversations, we'll have the discussions to see both sides of the equation, the point of view, and to work together to get the best result.
That's absolutely right. I mean, the Employment Relations Act is built on this, what they call the obligation of good faith. And that applies to both employees and to employers. And you've got to be open and communicative. That's what good faith means in action, essentially. Being open and communicative. Your employees should do that with you as an employer. And as an employer, you should do that with your employees as well. And if you do that, chances are you're on the right track. You're going to have a successful business, and you're probably going to also be legally compliant.
Which is always a bonus.
Exactly.
Okay. Gosh, there's so many questions I want to ask you, but I think that's given us a fair insight into it, because I think the biggest learning for me throughout this conversation is that you can be a values-based employer and you can treat values exactly like you would any other measurable in the business. And so don't feel afraid, as long as you've been really clear about what they are up front and been really clear about what that means, because it's not just about our value is humbly confident. You have to actually explain what humbly confident means from a work perspective, what it does mean, what it doesn't mean, set some boundaries around it, and then it becomes a measurable just like any other measurable.
Right. And you continue to track it throughout the relationship. Then you can absolutely do that.
Perfect. And then if we're going to make any changes to any part of their employment agreement, if you like, it has to be done openly. It has to be done with communication. We have to be willing to listen to both sides and come to a decision.
That's right. And that's where that process kind of driven approach comes. There's the Employment Relations Act has a really process driven approach. And that process is really about hearing the other side of the equation. And if you do that, then, you can probably make, changes, or you can probably do what it is that you want to achieve. So long as you do it in the right way through that right process.
And the process it's not spelled out in terms of you must do this. It's more about a framework, isn't it? That says that you need to have done these certain things.
That's right. I mean, it's a bit of a mixed model. Again, some of the complications of New Zealand employment law is that some of it isn't spelled out in legislation, but maybe is spelled out in case law. So certain processes probably are a bit more, there is a bit more kind of a clearer steps, these steps 1, 2, 3, 4 are spelled out. Other processes perhaps are a bit more open to different approaches. But also what the Employment Relations Act also recognises is that different sizes of employers can also result in different processes. So, if you're Air New Zealand or Spark, you're probably taking a really resource intensive process, and there's an expectation that you do that. And there's actually been a recent case that said that public sector organisations have a bigger obligation than perhaps smaller, SMEs, smaller private organisations. If you're a small sole trader with 2 or 3 employees, then you're not going to have the same sort of resource base to be able to go through this really intensive process. You need to go through some process, but not necessarily to the same level or to the same depth that might be expected from a larger organisation.
Okay. So what I'm taking from this is, that you have to follow the process. It is important that you have the conversations as soon as possible if you've got issues going on. And they often informal conversations to start off with before you take it to any kind kind of formal process.
Correct.
And then in reality, if it starts to get a bit sticky, you're best to get an expert involved, because
Absolutely.
it sounds like it's not a black and white, this is the way things go. It can be very much down to interpretation and
that's right.
Depending on what size you are, what the rules
exactly.
are.
And the processes can change based on how long the employee's been employed for, or what sort of role they do, or how big your organization is. So it can be really difficult to understand all of your procedural obligations as an employer if you don't have that sort of professional help or professional assistance kind of steering you in the right direction.
Sure. So tell us a little bit about Employsure, because why does Employsure exist?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, we just talked about a great example there. We really exist to help our clients have really successful businesses. So one of our visions is building better businesses, building fairer and safer businesses. We want to help our clients succeed. Particularly in New Zealand, we focus mainly on small and medium-sized enterprises. So those more, mum and dad, for lack of a better term, business owners who are probably really passionate about what they do. They're really passionate about driving trucks or building buildings or baking cakes or looking after kids or whatever it is that they do.
Yes.
Perhaps not so, knowledgeable about their legal obligations, particularly from an employment relations view or health and safety point of view. So what we want to do is help to ease that burden, take some of that burden away from our clients so that they can focus on what they're really passionate about. We have a number of different service elements that we provide that help clients do that, but it's all in the means of making them able to be compliant in a way that works for their business, and in a way that means they have to spend less time, energy, and money on it than they might otherwise have to. So we really want our clients to focus on the things that they're really passionate about, and leave the legalese, leave the messy stuff to us, basically.
Health and safety, that kind of stuff. So I mean, the idea is that we call them a fractional employee, which means that you've kind of got somebody who's on your team who's not there full time, but that you can call upon as if they were part of your team as and when needed.
Exactly. And we actually operate a 24-hour-a-day, 7-day a week, 365-day a year advice line.
Oh, wow.
We get clients that call us at 3 a.m. in the morning.
Oh, really?
Or we get clients that call us on Christmas Day or New Year's Day. And we're available the whole time to help our clients with any issue that they have, because we know that issues can pop up at any time. And we've got a lot of tradies or construction organizations or businesses, and they are often on site, kind of 7 a.m. to 7 p.m. And they do all of their admin at 10 p.m. at night. And we're really there to help them when they want to do it, but also to do it in a way that helps them to be successful. So if we can really make sure they're being compliant without compromising on their vision or their values as an organization, then you can have a really successful business, I think. You don't want to let the law get in the way, basically.
Yeah, no, that's fantastic. Okay. Quickly, 3 top tips. What were your 3 kind of top tips for privately owned business employers?
Well, we've kind of spoken about communication already.
Yes.
So I won't beat that dead horse too much, but it's really, I think, about having policies, paper trails, documentations, contracts. Not only is that a legal obligation, but it's also really important from, making sure there's clear obligations or clear expectations, and really having a successful relationship and keeping those current, as we talked about at the start. Making sure you're changing those as you go along. So that would be number 1. I think number 2 is really about making sure that you get it right from day one. We have a lot of clients and we can help out with that, but it's a lot harder to fix a problem after it's become a problem than it is to stop the problem happening in the first place. So being proactive, for example, making sure you're recruiting the right people, spending the time at the recruitment stage rather than when it becomes a problem stage. Maybe overcoming that typical Kiwi culture of being a bit more laid back and being proactive about it. And I think it's really about engaging, training, making sure your staff are on the same page as you are. If you're all moving in the same direction, you can have a really successful business, and you're going to have really happy employees that are going to want to be there, are going to attract further employees to your organization, and are going to give you the best that they possibly can. So you've got to engage them, you've got to give them the opportunity, you've got to train them and support them to be successful. And it may seem like a big burden at the start, but it'll pay off in the long run, I promise.
Absolutely. Giving them, we talk about, there's the resources that they need, as in they need a computer and they need a phone, but they actually need time more than anything. Time and training and to get them on board and keep them in the loop in terms of what's going on.
That's right. Yeah, absolutely.
Perfect. Okay, cool. So what is the ideal client for Employsure? What does it look like?
We mainly focus on, as I said, small and medium-sized enterprises. We've got clients from all industries, basically. So industry-wise, we'll help you, basically. We've got clients from trades and construction all the way to law firms, for example, as clients as well. But we're really looking at that kind of SME or even potentially micro SME type size. So maybe 10 to 20 employees. Having said that, we've got lots of sole traders. We've got some clients with thousands of employees. So we can help at that end. But it's really really about those kind of middle growing organizations that want support, perhaps don't have the resources to get their own in-house lawyer or in-house HR advisor, or, to be able to pay a law firm to draft all their contracts. They want that support, but they want to do it in a way that supports their growth. So we're looking for those sorts of clients. Those are the sorts of clients that really form a really good relationship with us, and we can really help succeed.
And I think what's really important too, it's a little bit like using a virtual assistant agency, is that by having a team of people, which Employsure has, you've got lots of different specialists, right? Which means you're actually you're paying for, a fractional part of a role, but you can actually tap into the various different areas as and when needed. So you've got health and safety, you've got contracts, you've got disputes.
Exactly. And so we help all the way from the formation of the documentation. We'll go out to an employer's site and draft the documentation. I talked about our 24-hour a day, 7-day a week advice line. We've got a legal team that can help if you get those really sticky, messy situations. And we've got a team that can come out and visit you face to face as well, if you like. And kind of to the point you made earlier as well, a really diverse set of advisors within our organization. So, I come from a employee focused background. Working at community law, we've got clients, employees that come from unions, from large organizations, from medium sized organizations that come from all walks of life. Some have qualifications, some come from retail backgrounds. We want to understand our clients' businesses. And if we do that, we can help them succeed. So chances are we've got someone that can help you.
Oh, that is fantastic. I tell you what, honestly, there's this has actually been quite reassuring for me, because I've always found that I've worked in Australia, I've worked in the US, and I've worked over here, and I always thought the New Zealand employment law was probably one of the most difficult ones.
It is.
But I think that at the same time, what you've actually made me realise is that there is a way through it, and it really is about being open, having that communication, and just making sure that you're on the same page, and when you're not, you resolve it. Yeah.
It's not about trying to kind of bundle the employment law to the side and trying to work around it.
No.
If you can work with it in unison, it can really help your business succeed. It cannot have to be a barrier in your way that you have to jump over. And if you do that proactively, then, who knows what the limits are.
No, that is fantastic. Hey, look, thank you so much for your time. Really appreciate you coming in.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
Thank you. And if you want to contact Laurence, you can find him, I think, on the Employsure website.
Employsure.co.nz. Or you can just search Employsure on Google and it'll come up.
Fantastic. Hey, thank you for your time.
Cheers. Thank you.
Thanks.